Hello, and welcome back to Creedal Catholic. I'm back from my month and a half long or so hiatus. It's basically lined up with the Easter season, and it's been a great time to refresh a little bit, to think about some programming, and to record a lot of episodes. So I've got a lot of great content coming your way beginning today. But just to give you a sneak preview of some of the things that I have coming down the line, I'm talking to Simone Riscala again about the life of a great saint and doctor of the church, talking to a consecrated virgin about how she discerned that vocation. I'm doing a series on Protestant Reformed theology with Casey Chalk, who's reappearing on the podcast. And we're walking through in a 5-part series, TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, and we'll talk more about all of that. Not confirmed yet, but I'm going to try to get John Waters back on the show for a discussion of Give Us Back the Bad Roads, his recent book. And in fact, John's had a kind of an interesting couple of experiences since he was last on the podcast when we talked about the two popes. He has since run for Parliament in Ireland unsuccessfully, although I think he was trying to make a statement more than anything. When I talked to him about it, he said that even just a few weeks prior, he didn't realize it was going to happen, but then it did, and I think he was able to articulate some of his ideas in doing so, and I think that was his goal. He's also been involved in a lawsuit against the Irish government over coronavirus restrictions. And I really don't know enough to know whether or not I agree with his thinking on that, but I'd love to sit down with him and just talk to him a little bit more about that. I think that'd be interesting. I'm certainly sympathetic to people who are challenging government overreach in the light of coronavirus. I think it's been interesting to see how our society in general has responded or failed to respond or responded uniquely to what has been a devastating pandemic for many and a not at all devastating pandemic for many more. And I don't mean that at all to minimize the real suffering that has gone on. But if you look at just the geographical distribution of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States, it's concentrated in a few key areas. I mean, New York is the main epicenter. Detroit, Michigan has a number of cases, Chicago, Los Angeles, big cities, New Orleans. But then there are large swaths of the country that have not been affected. And I think it's interesting to see the polarization that's happening from that and the finger pointing that goes along with that. Those who feel unaffected by the virus point to government and just say this is a power grab by the people in charge. Those who have been seriously affected in a medical sense by losing a family member or having a brush with death themselves, then look at all of the people in the former camp and point fingers and say, why do you want to kill me or kill my grandma or whatever? There's a lot of finger pointing going on. There's not enough stepping back and thinking carefully about this. And so what I want to do today is a little bit of that. Now, it's going to be in a different sense. We don't talk about policy at all, me and Father Giambrone today. But what we do talk about is what Father Giambrone calls the final why. Why coronavirus? What is coronavirus? Is it appropriate to think of coronavirus as something from God? Or do we hold that God cannot possibly cause a pandemic, as the German Bishops' Conference recently declared? So we talk about all these ideas and more. It's a really good conversation, but I wanted to say thanks for sticking with the feed in the hiatus. Thanks for giving me the time to step back and prepare some new content. And I hope you enjoy this and many of the other episodes that we have coming along soon. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening to Creedal Catholic, and we'll be back with more next week. Enjoy this conversation with Father Giambrone. All right, welcome back to another episode of Creedal Catholic. Today, I'm joined by Father Anthony Giambrone, who is a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, which is the eastern province of the United States. And he's professor of New Testament and vice director of the, please excuse my French, Father, École biblique et archéologique française in Jerusalem.
Très bien.
I know I totally butchered that.
Very good.
But it's the French School of Bible and Theology in Jerusalem. He's authored more than 200 academic and popular publications focused on a range of biblical and theological themes. His most recent forthcoming works are One Sacrifice for Sins, a Biblical Theology of the Priesthood, published by Baker Academic this year, and he's the editor of Rethinking the Jewish War, Archeology, Society, and Traditions, also forthcoming this year. Presently, as a visiting Humboldt Fellow at Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich, his project is a book exploring the ecclesiology of Acts. Lots of fantastic stuff in there, Father Anthony. Welcome to Creedal Catholic.
Thank you.
So, dear listeners, I first came across Father Anthony's work, and I've explored a little bit more of it since coming across a lecture that he gave in the beginning of April for the Thomistic Institute. The Thomistic Institute, by the way, is a fantastic resource. Lots of podcasts, lots of resources from great theological thinkers, and it is run by the Eastern Province, of which Father Anthony is a part. And on April 2nd, Father Anthony gave this great lecture on that podcast feed called Plagues, What We Can Learn from the Bible. And in it, he did not shy away at all from these questions about, whether or not God causes plagues, what the final why of a plague is, what the Bible teaches us about plagues and pandemics and everything. And I thought it was a really fascinating lecture and would be a great opportunity to get him on the podcast and talk to you, my listeners, a little bit more about some of those ideas. So, Father Anthony, I'm looking forward to talking about these topics with you today. But something else caught my eye in your lecture, or caught my ear, I should say, and that's when you described Emmanuel Macron of France as your sometime breakfast partner. So is this actually true? Do you have breakfast with with Macron from time to time?
I probably should have said my one-time breakfast partner, and actually all he had was coffee. No. Yes. I mean, that's all true. And he does like Pop-Tarts, and I know that, but I'll confess we're not too close. He just came visited because being the French school in Jerusalem, the French are a tribal people, and when the president comes to town, he comes to the École. So we had him over, and I got to eat croissants with him.
Very nice. Now, obviously, France is a country with a rich and storied history of the Catholic faith. But it's also a country that's lapsed into secularism much since then, at least. I don't even know. I should know. Is Macron a professing Catholic?
He's interesting. He's probably representative of a huge percentage of the population. So he's baptized, though in his case, it's more interesting that he actually discovered the faith as a teenager and asked for baptism at 16. And had a kind of period of, maybe more devout practice, became the custodian of a kind of famous French thinker, Paul Ricoeur, when he was in his old age, and was trained by the Jesuits and so forth, but not a very observant Catholic at this point, and I don't think would identify too strongly with that history.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it seems to be a fairly common story, and I haven't spent much time in France, so I can't speak for the French people, but at least seems to be a common story across the Western world more broadly. These people who come to some understanding of faith have perhaps a beginning appreciation for the sacraments, but they fail to dig deep into the Catholic tradition. And so as they grow up and they figure out that there are many competing ideas out there, they tend to, I think, sort of backtrack from the core tenets of the faith, throw up their hands and say, it's complicated, but I believe in the existence of a higher power in some way, but we can't know too much about it, so I don't even try.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, there's a kind of encroaching secularism that can easily defeat an under-catechized and prepared Catholic, and a lot of people fall victim to that. It's a shame. I mean, there's a huge cultural, meaning artistic and intellectual heritage in the church there in France, but not everyone has access to it.
Well, it does make me grateful to know that God is still acting in history, and that brings us to the topic of today's podcast, which is this current pandemic and God's role in it. And I think it's become sort of a challenge to secular and religious minds alike. But for different reasons. I think it's a challenge to religious minds because we wonder, how can God let something like this happen? Or we question, what is God's role in this? What is God's agency? Is God in some way causing this? Or do we agree with the German Bishops' Conference, as you mentioned in your lecture, that God is not the author of plagues ever, full stop? And then to the secular mind, I think this is challenging because, as you pointed out in your lecture, the plague is not a modern thing. It conjures up images of the Black Death, perhaps, in the most extreme examples that swept across Europe in the 15th century or 14th century. But maybe more recently, the Spanish influenza of 100 years ago. But that's still 100 years ago, long before all of the advances of modern medicine that we now enjoy today. So this pandemic has caused even the secular mind to confront some big questions that we, I think, aren't used to confronting. And you start your lecture with a quote from Albert Camus' novel, or a novel of Albert Camus. What's the novel called again?
The Plague.
The Plague, of course, yeah.
Fittingly,
yeah. So it's called The Plague, and there's this character, Dr. Ryu, in there who says that the plague is not a modern way to die. It was a fitting way to start your lecture, I think. But what do you think Camus is meaning by that when he has the character of Dr. Ryu declare that the plague is not a modern way to die?
I think you already kind of put your finger on it. I mean, we have these images of Middle Ages and flagellants and people who don't know what germs are, who are subject to these natural phenomenon that they can't understand, and so they turn it into a story about God, a myth about God, something like that. We're much more enlightened now. Now we have modern science, and we have clean hospitals. We know what germs are, and so forth. So we're not going to be subject to either to the spread of disease in stupid preventable ways, or the kind of cosmic illusions that might have seduced earlier generations. So I think it's basically just an expression of this massive alienation, maybe from what had been a pretty consistent experience of the human race for a few millennia, that we feel ourselves separated from.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And there's a part of your lecture where you talk about how COVID-19 is a distraction. And I want to dive into that a little bit more. In what you just said, you were making me think about how the modern mind realizes that we know so much more about the natural world than we once did. And so where we once may have attributed plagues or infectious diseases to, bad humor, or, just a lack of understanding of microbiology, we didn't know about germs and how viruses work and the mechanistic processes behind those things. Or perhaps even we had this sort of superstitious, almost karmic idea of how and why people got sick. And all of that kind of goes out the window when we now understand the exact mechanics, biomechanics of a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or a parasite, et cetera. But I think one of the risks of that, which you illustrate in your lecture pretty well, is that if we get so preoccupied with this sort of physical question of why, we get distracted from the big question of why. I think you call it the final why. But can you talk a little bit more about that? How COVID-19, while presenting a sort of radical challenge to our secular modernist assumptions, also perhaps paradoxically distracts us from asking the ultimate questions.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think Camus is still helpful here. So he gives us this medical doctor, who kind of represents our modern perspective, technical perspective, scientific perspective on all of these things. But he's contrasted with this foil of this kind of old wild man priest, who's a relic from the Middle Ages in his own way and has these harangues from the pulpit and so forth. So I think what he's trying to articulate there for us is something helpful. On the one hand, there's this explanation. Okay, this happened by what we would say is a kind of material or efficient causality. Okay, so just a series of atoms, hitting one another, or if you want, just this spherical single strain RNA virus, a protein molecule, limpid envelope, has these club shaped projections. And that's all we're talking about. In fact, it's quite remarkable, actually. I mean, I had watched a couple of these little programs just trying to explain what COVID-19 is. And some of them really get evangelical about this, that this is only a piece of protein and it's nothing else. And if you see anything else in this whole pandemic, I mean, you're a wild fanatic. So it's this microscopic view, I mean, in the strongest sense of the term, that's contrasted then with, this vision embodied by the priest, who thinks, okay, well, it's there because of your guilt, or there's some act of God here. So I think that's the dilemma that's at work, and that's why I say, as a bit of a provocation, that COVID itself, I mean, this coronavirus is the immense distraction, because I mean, when you look at what we do, I mean, we mobilize all of the collective forces of the entire governmental medical establishment of the planet, coerce the cooperation of every individual, all just to defeat this 100 nanometer molecule, as though that's our real enemy. You find yourself in this stupid situation that Camus rightly understood as absurdity. It's Sisyphus. So we might beat COVID-19. Hopefully we will. We probably will. We've beat other viruses in the past. We beat smallpox. It was a brilliant chapter, in the first chapter in the history of the young science of virology. Okay, so maybe we'll get a vaccine and beat this. But then there was SARS-1, there's SARS-2, there'll be SARS-3. Who knows? The point is, death will keep rolling back against us as we push and push and push against it, with all our scientific and technical know-how. And so to me, the great danger is you focus so much on beating this tiny little thing, which is, okay, a deadly flu that's passing around and imperiling us in very real ways. But what we fail to notice is we're being confronted with our mortality, which is a lot bigger than just COVID. I mean, people die for all kinds of reasons, and this is the much more interesting and important fact in a way. And this is what a pandemic throws in our face, is death, with a big capital D.
I appreciate the way that you illustrate how a Christian should think about these things, or maybe suggest some ideas, a framework for thinking about these things, by referencing the Old Testament. And you talk about the occurrence and recurrence of biblical plagues in the Old Testament, not least, of course, when God freed the Israelites from bondage and allowed Moses to lead them out of Egypt towards the promised land. But then you say that we live after Moses in an after virtue sort of way. Of course, after virtue referring to the great philosopher Alistair MacIntyre's work on that. But can you talk a little bit more about that? How are we living after Moses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a little quip there, but the sense, I mean, so MacIntyre's thesis is that we have the scraps of a kind of coherent worldview that are still jingling around in our language. So we still talk about virtue and all of these things, but we don't have the coherent framework in which they make any sense. I think there's something similar, I guess, to the way there's still fragments and scraps of biblical literacy. I mean, it's evaporating and disappearing quickly, but we have these disconnected elements of a worldview that once made sense, which are, I guess, at most an impediment today to reinserting ourselves into a faith perspective informed by the light of revelation. So we live after Moses, I'd say, because between here and there, so the Bible's filled with, I mean, sins sparking angry plagues come a dime a dozen. They're just all over the place. And again, back to, it's not a modern way to die. There's so much between us and the episode of the golden calf where God sends a plague immediately, or the complaining about the manna, God sends a plague immediately, and so forth. We, on the one hand, I mean, there's the difference between the pre and the post-Christian worlds, but there's also a great deal of both real and pretended enlightenment. So, I mean, science is a real thing, modern science. It's not that we want to deny this in any way. There's this extraordinary Greek journey from myths to philosophy. This kind of entrance out of what was a kind of more ignorant approach to the world. There's the blending of this Greek wisdom to Israel's Bible and its Christian God, and then we have the whole modern Enlightenment, Kant, these sorts of things, in which God himself becomes a kind of fading postulate of practical reason. So anyway, all of which is just to underline the quite obvious point that it's very hard for us to accept a biblical perspective on things as valid or as making any claim on modern reality. It just feels too far away.
Right. And I really appreciate what you said there about how modern science is real. And those who are advocating a biblical perspective on these things, like yourself, are not saying otherwise. You're not saying this is God, not a virus, right? I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. They're not incompatible. I think the biblical perspective would be that God is, in fact, the final why of this virus. And the way that his purposes are accomplished are through this nanometers long collection of proteins that is SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID, right?
Right.
Well, let's talk about this biblical perspective a little bit more, because this is pretty complicated. And on the topic of sort of neglecting the acts of God or the purpose of God in this thing, one of the most disturbing episodes for me of this has been how the church itself, in some quarters, has tried to undercut that thesis. And I'm thinking of something that you also mentioned in your lecture, the German Bishops' Conference, who said that sickness is not a divine punishment. There's a bishop in the German Bishops' Conference who has gone further and said that basically since God sent his son to die on the cross, he hasn't known any thoughts of punishment. So that seems to suggest some sort of discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments, or at the very least, some sort of rupture in the nature of God, that he hasn't known thoughts since X time. But it seems to me that if you're going to take the position of the German Bishops' Conference, you're going to have to either say that the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore. You're going to have to issue some interpretation of the Old Testament that is quite tenuous and novel and probably wrong. Or you're going to have to claim that there is some sort of discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments. So first of all, do you agree with that sort of positioning of the argument? And second, how can we make sense of these Old Testament things? So the second question there is a really big one, and we can break it down a little further.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, in fairness to the German bishops, they're not alone here in saying this. It's kind of a pervasive, approach to this situation, certainly perspective, and it probably just underscores this after Moses kind of perspective. We can say it's also after Jesus, and so after Jesus, Old Testament just kind of fades away. I mean, that's an old heresy. I mean, it's not a new problem in a way. I mean, so actually, very shortly after Jesus, we have the Marcionite heresy, which does introduce not just a kind of distinction between the Old and New Testament, but I think, as you rightly see there, you kind of introduce a cleavage into God. So it actually ends up with two gods. You have the angry God of the Old Testament, and the happy fuzzy God of Jesus. In terms of, I mean, you don't want, on the one hand, I mean, I think it was your third of the trichotomy there. I mean, there is a kind of discontinuity, in continuity presented by the New Testament. So it's not that we deny the novum represented by the revelation of Jesus, but the thing is, it's the same God, the one author of the Old and New Testaments, the one God who is the Father of the Son, who is Jesus Christ. So I think what you have to understand is that the new clarity of revelation that's accessible in the incarnation, the resurrection, exaltation of our Lord, illumines the Old Testament in a new way. So we read the Old Testament in the light of the New, just as we understand the New in light of the prophetic trajectory of the old. So binding the two together is quite important. And to that extent, the continuity, I guess, needs to be forcefully asserted. I gave in the lecture one example of what I think is a Christological reading of a plague in the Old Testament. I think this famous story of David in 2 Samuel 24, where he gets a choice of punishments and chooses the plague. I think it's a prophetic story that's actually pointing very directly to Jesus Christ, as a matter of fact, pointing to his sacrifice on the cross. And so this is how the kind of backwards look from Jesus into the Old Testament validates what God has always been doing, and to that extent, I guess, clarifies what he's still up to. So, I mean, with due respect to the new president of the German Bishops' Conference, it doesn't seem that he's read too widely in the New Testament, because, I mean, it's very, very clear that, I mean, the very first chapter chronologically that appears in the New Testament, first chapter of First Thessalonians, St. Paul says very, very clearly that the wrath of God has been revealed. I mean, so it's not that this idea just goes away. It's reconfigured. It's understood in a new light in terms of the project God always had, that we can find salvation from the punishment due to our sins. So, I mean, in the story with David there, it's quite an interesting, intricate thing. I don't need to go into all the details, but the key point is that this thing would annihilate everyone. Okay, the power of punishment brought on by sin imperils everyone. Okay, and there's actually a kind of image here of original sin in the way that the sin of one man brings the disastrous fate upon the nation. Okay, but it's interrupted, it's stopped by God's mercy, in fact. And David's choice for the plagues, actually, he articulates it as he wants to fall into the hands of God rather than the hands of man, because God is merciful. So God's mercy is actually the point of the story, and the plague ends on the very site of the temple. An angel shows up and stops the thing. And that's very clearly, in context, meant to be a prophecy that this is the place where sacrifice is going to be offered, and that sacrifice is going to atone for sin. It's going to stop the punishment of sin. That sacrifice of the temple is itself a prophecy. So we have a prophecy of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross that's going to show up and plant its foot in the ground and say, thus far you shall come and no farther. So, I mean, the power of mercy, I think this is the problem. We rightly understand that Jesus came to proclaim the mercy of God. The power of mercy is measured by its strength to overcome an already strong wrath. I mean, mercy doesn't make any sense if it doesn't intervene to save us. I mean, there's lots of literary examples we could come up with this. There's Mozart has a great opera, the Clemency of Titus, about the Emperor Titus, and his clemency, his mercy, is shown at the end of the whole story by the fact that he's completely justified in punishing his friend who betrays him. Okay, but he doesn't. Okay, it's because he deserves a capital punishment. Everyone thinks he's going to just put him to death, but instead he forgives his sin. Okay, we only see that because the guy's guilty. So I think in the same way, you don't understand the significance of the New Testament if you don't understand the deadly power of sin. And so this, back to death with a capital D. I mean, what's the death we're really talking about? What's the punishment we're really concerned about? Is it ultimately just falling to COVID, or is it the second death of Revelation? So I think that's the bigger framework you have to put an interpretation, I mean, a biblical worldview into, but this effort to draw the continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just a quick note on the passage in 2 Samuel that you talked about, in which David is choosing between the various forms of punishment from God. I appreciate your exposition of that in the lecture itself and elaborated on just now, and how it's that in itself is an anticipation of Christ. But it just occurred to me that he has the choice of choosing 3 days pestilence and 3 days of death in atonement for the sins, and that alone foreshadows the 3 days that Christ spent in the grave, which is pretty cool.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the way we need to approach the continuity between the Testaments. Is that the Old Testament is in fact always talking about the revelation of Christ.
Now, this does get at, I think, a fundamental problem that I've come across in doing apologetics, that I think I sometimes sort of fall into myself, and that's to sort of create a dichotomy between the Old and New Testaments. When I'm doing apologetics, it's pretty easy to talk about Jesus Christ dying for you. Now, it might be hard to talk about Jesus Christ as God incarnate, and that's kind of a tougher pill for people to swallow. But the message of the cross is an attractive one for people, that the creator of the universe does love them enough to die for them, etc. But then I've had pushback when people look at the Old Testament and say, like, what about this? I think you mentioned the ban in Joshua, right? When God says go and kill everybody here, etc. Now, there are some sort of interpretative things that you can do to make those passages a little more palatable, perhaps. But fundamentally, there's still the problem of God acting through history in these sorts of ways, in sending a plague, for example.
Right.
And so if we're going to say that God does act through history, including by sending plagues, how do we get around this problem of God not being the author of evil?
Well, I mean, I think, yes. I mean, so God's acting in histories. He's doing these sorts of things. I mean, we need to understand at least a couple things. I mean, on the level of his action in history, we need to understand primary and secondary causality. We can come back to that. On the level of the text, when we're reading these passages like the ban in Joshua or something, it's also important, I guess, that we have a sophisticated manner of interpreting. So this is a good instance. As modern people, we're very good at watching movies. Like we get it naturally. It's quite easy. I know how to watch a movie. We're very bad at reading like Semitic texts from the second millennium BC. That's hard.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit of work, but it's actually not so complicated. So when I watch a World War II movie, by the literary genre, the Germans are bad guys. I don't care if they have families. They're bad guys. And so that's how it works, which is different than, like in Saving Private Ryan, there's this moment where the two soldiers, you always have these in war movies. There's the moment where the two guys meet and they realize they're people and they're not just bad guy, good guy. It's like orcs. Orcs don't have families, like in Lord of the Rings. They're just bad guys. They're bad guys in the Bible too. And sometimes I think we just have a naive sense that ancient people couldn't think the way we did. So like Egyptians getting, plunged into this, you're not asking the question about their families or the ban. You're not asking the Canaanites are the bad guys. So I think in some ways this is also just an invitation to a different kind of approach to the literature that we're reading. Then, like I said, in terms of the history itself, I think we need to understand, and this is more of a philosophical than exegetical point, but need to understand how primary and secondary causality works. That's a kind of fundamental metaphysical, certainly very Thomistic distinction to make, but God is the primary cause of no evil. And I think this puts us into a paradigm point of view in which we can understand a little bit his agency, even in something like the COVID pandemic, is God's God's operative, God's an ultimate cause behind these things, which doesn't necessarily need to make him the direct efficient cause. So that's back to this point. I mean, you alluded to it earlier. I mean, in terms of different kinds of why, are we talking about basically the mechanical how, which is basically just a chain of, it's a domino chain from, let's say, these wet markets in Wuhan, to international travelers, to someone in a nursing home in New York or whatever. I mean, there's physical chains of causality, and that's efficient causality, but that's a different order of agency than other sorts of metaphysical causality, like the final cause. Like, why is this happening, in the sense of for what purpose is this happening? So, I mean, once we can start to make those kinds of distinctions, we can see in what ways God is involved in something and is not involved in something. And in that way, our theodicy to free him of our own guilt. I mean, this is kind of the remarkable thing, is we've managed to project our own human guilt onto God, but how we can free him from the guilt, the errors of our own mismanaged lives.
Yeah, that all makes sense, and I always appreciate when guests bring in Thomistic principles of metaphysics into the conversation. I'm reminded of I was reading this book recently by the philosopher Ed Feser, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, and those 5 proofs that he uses are different from Thomas's 5 proofs, or 5 ways. But the first one has in common a lot with the first of Thomas's, but he really draws primarily from Aristotle, and it's basically the first mover one. But he makes this distinction as well that God is the ultimate cause, in the sense that God is at the base of all being, of all ontology.
Right.
And so in that sense, everything that happens has its source in God, but only because God's existence is necessary for anything to be there. I mean, everything else is contingent upon the existence of God. But in applying God's action specifically to this nanometers long collection of proteins that causes viral infections, I mean, what can we say God is the author of? Has God uniquely fashioned this virus and released it upon the world, or is the virus itself a product of the corruption of nature by our primeval sin, perpetuated in our original sin, and God is redirecting the effects of our own sin ultimately for our good, even if we can't see it right now? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what to say? That's God can and does do both of these things. Okay, he can intervene in extraordinary ways, and he can also direct nature's course to his ends and purposes. I mean, and that's not at all an unbiblical thing to think that nature itself is somehow the servant of God's purposes. I mean, especially in the wisdom literature, we see this in a very direct way. In fact, there's a monstrous German expression. Germans were always there first and got to name everything in exegesis, but it's called the Tun-Ergehen Zusammenhang, and it means the kind of interconnection between actions and consequences. So there's, and this is all over in the book of Proverbs, Sirach, and so forth. I mean, there is a sense in which, without turning into a pantheist or something, these people who think it's nature's revenge might be closer to, the truth than they understand. I mean, we can reap what we sow. I mean, that's the proverbial wisdom there. So it certainly can be that. Whether God fabricated this, out of nothing and threw it like a thunderbolt into the world, that's a little harder to prove or
right.
sustain. Or, I mean, it's not that we need that either. I mean, he can accomplish his purposes based on this extraordinary world that he created.
Yeah, and I think that the last part that you mentioned is the part that a lot of secular people need to hear when they criticize, quote, religious people as being superstitious, right? I mean, the argument is rarely, if ever. I mean, I'm sure there are some people out there who advance the argument that I am not advancing, but the argument that I'm advancing is not that God, fashioned this in heaven and threw it down to earth, and where it landed was Wuhan, and it sort of expanded out from there, right? I mean, there are natural explanations to the origins of this virus that do not speak to the supernatural explanations, because the supernatural origin directs the natural origin, right?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it's in no more competition. I mean, it's why it's the same stumbling block. But I mean, it's like a creation evolution question. I mean, God can order, natural processes and so forth to attain his designs. And these are not incompatible modes of causality. These are complementary modes of causality. So by the fact that you're not going to trace back the empirical chain, past the wet markets and then hit God, that doesn't mean anything. That's not the order of causality we're talking about.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, an apologetic point that, as you say, is often lost.
Now, I think maybe a final question on this topic before we wrap up here is, what do you think, I mean, based on the biblical record, based on how God has used pandemics before, has used them for his purposes, what do you think are some plausible things that the church should be thinking about in this pandemic? Perhaps a greater call to faithfulness, perhaps a reminder of our complete dependence on God, perhaps all of the above. But I think there are some things that the church should be taking away from this that go beyond simply, let's preserve physical life at all possible costs.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to be asking, and the question that we're not really asking. I mean, I'd certainly check the all of above, as you said there. I mean, I think God has given us an extraordinary moment of self-reflection. I mean, the overdrive of divine providence in these moments is bewildering. Like, every life is touched in profound ways, some in very profound ways. I mean, I know a lot of people who are seriously affected in both good and painful ways by all of this. It's very, in my own way, I'm very, very affected. I'm trapped here, for months, unsure of, I've got a desk full of work in Jerusalem I can't get to, and so forth. I mean, so God has interrupted all of our plans, and I think we need to let him do that and really say, okay, God, I mean, how seriously do you really want to reboot everything in my life, in my family's life, in our communities, in our nations, in our society, and so forth? I mean, I think that's a big part of the challenge of this, is just to give the space, the freedom to ask whether we need to change very fundamental priorities, very fundamental projects. I mean, and to that extent, it's certainly an invitation to invite God back into a lot of these, a lot of our lives, all of us in deeper ways. But it's not hard, as a church, to look out on society and say, okay, this is a society that's moving, if we're just talking about natural cycles, okay, in terms of a sociological cycle, this is a society that is courting self-destruction. When do we pause and reflect? And in the same way, honestly, I think this is a very important moment of critical self-reflection for the church. There's grave corruption, wickedness, evil at work in the church. I mean, we have the joy of living, in this wake of an extraordinary ecumenical council, and we have to ask if we're accurately, receiving the graces of reform as they should have been and should now be received, and so forth. So I think these are questions we need to pose pretty seriously, with trust in God. Maybe that's that's what will come of this moment. It's hard to ignore that it all hit during Lent. I mean, in its own way, it's a kind of desert experience. It's a fasting experience for the church to live apart from the Eucharist for so long. I think is a challenge. Reminds us of this incredible word that he speaks. I'm going to send you in Hosea, send you not a famine for bread, but for the word of God. Are we starving ourselves on a hunger fast where the word of God doesn't play a role in our lives? So these are the kind of, I guess, foundational examination of conscience, it seems to me, is maybe proper to the moment.
Yeah, it's well said, Father. I'm thinking of the passage in Luke chapter 21, where Jesus is describing some things that will come to pass at the end of times. And it says that your salvation is nearer now than you thought. And I'm not necessarily implying that this is the end times. None of us know when the end times is. And to a degree, I think that question is a fruitless one to try to answer, because we could all be living in the end times and not know it. So we need to all be acting, keeping our lamps trimmed as if we are living in the end times. I'm also thinking of, I think it's Romans chapter 13, where Paul says that salvation is nearer now. And the fact that our destruction in this way is very near to us, and all of us feel vulnerable and afraid. I mean, especially those who are elderly or already infirm, et cetera. Our destruction physically is very near to us, which makes us, I hope prompts us to cling ever more closely to our eternal salvation. A final question for you. I don't want to get you in trouble by asking you to comment on any of the USCCB actions or various diocesan actions here, but I will speak for myself and say that I've been frustrated by many bishops and pastors' response to this. And I'm not even going to single out any particular bishops, but I have friends in various parts of the U.S. who have been denied access to all of the sacraments entirely. Even drive-up confessions banned. Infants who are born can't even have private baptisms with just family and godparents. I mean, these really what I would call ridiculous restrictions on the sacraments. And I've been criticized, or maybe not me personally, but I've seen others who think like I do criticized for, wanting to endanger people, et cetera, or being reckless and in pursuit of the sacraments, et cetera. And I think none of that's true. I think a lot of those criticisms, at least, sort of paint with an overly broad brush. There are certainly people who just think that, I don't know, COVID-19 is all a hoax or whatever. I mean, that's not my contention at all. I think my frustration is that our bishops should always be our pastors spiritually and be seeking first our spiritual welfare, and then and only then our physical welfare. I go to my doctor for my physical welfare. I go to my pastor and my bishop for my spiritual welfare. And what I saw from a lot of bishops, again, not pointing fingers or naming names, what I saw from a lot of bishops was a concern first and foremost for my physical welfare. But that's not what I want from my bishop. And so my question for you, because I don't want to get you in trouble and ask you to say something you shouldn't or comment on something you shouldn't, perhaps. My question for you is simply this: what's your advice for a layperson like myself in sort of enduring these trials and these frustrations and these impatiences with the leadership of the church?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fair question, and it's back to where we started a little bit. This false forced choice between a doctor and a priest, Dr. Ryu and Father Panelu in Camus. I mean, that's not a choice we should be forced to make. I mean, any more than we have to choose between science and faith. So I do think there's a very important burden. I'll avoid commenting too much, but there's a very important pastoral burden that the church has in what is a pretty extraordinary circumstance, but also not an unknown circumstance. I mean, precisely what we're saying. I mean, plagues didn't stop in the Bible. They've kept going beyond that. And so the church actually does have experience of this and how to deal with this, and quarantine experiences as well. I mean, actually in the Black Death, there were quarantines too, and so forth. And there's a famous instance of Charles Borromeo saying mass in the city square, and everyone just watching from out their windows and that kind of thing. I mean, whatever. There were creative solutions, but they also understood social distance. They weren't so dumb as we like to pretend. So, it's probably important on the one hand for the church to draw on the wealth of her experience and wisdom. For the layman, I think this experience, honestly, of being deprived of the sacraments it reminds me a lot of, there's this kind of famous passage in Pope Benedict's, then Ratzinger, I guess, The Spirit of the Liturgy, in which he talks about Eucharistic fasting, and the way in which it can be turned to spiritual profit. He's speaking, for instance, about fasting from the Eucharist in order to live in communion with those who are separated from the Eucharist, and pray for, acknowledge the wounds in the body of Christ, and use that pain and distance from the sacrament to invite a healing within the body, the one body of the church. So, I think maybe there's a way in which there's a spirituality of fasting, honestly, and even sacramental fasting, that can bring good out of evil. There's Romans 8:28. It's not as though we're ever put in a circumstance by providence that can't be turned to our profit. Even when there's the failures of responsible people that have created an unfortunate situation. So I think offering the suffering, the isolation, the anger, the frustration, the loneliness, all of the things that are kind of wrapped up with this, and discovering in that fasting also a new purified hunger for the sacraments, as something that are a gift. I think this is a dimension too, is, maybe we can not just have a kind of blasé sense about this, but maybe an entitlement that needs to be purified too. So I think maybe those are the kinds of reflections, the orientation we might take to trying to live through this moment.
Well, thank you for that spiritual counsel, Father. I really appreciate it, and I hope my listeners do as well. For my own part, I'm really hoping, and who can discern the ways of God and the intentions of God, but I'm really hoping that this time of pandemic is a way for the church to turn inward towards Jesus Christ in the Eucharist at her center, and then be able to turn outward. Because one thing, as we've discussed, one thing this pandemic has really made crystal clear is that the world needs Christ, and has lost a total regard for supernaturalism. And I think that this pandemic is an opportunity for the church to renew her evangelistic efforts while also refocusing on her Eucharistic center. So that's my prayer, and hopefully that's the prayer of many others in the church as well. So hopefully we can see God carrying out great renewal through his purposes here.
Yes.
Well, Father Anthony, that's all I have for you today. I really appreciate your time. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate your lecture as well, which went into some of this stuff in much greater and more scholarly detail, and probably better laid out as well, since you wrote that one and I constructed these questions for us. But so I encourage our listeners to go check that out. It's on the Thomistic Institute podcast feed. It's from April 2nd, and it's called Plagues, What We Can Learn from the Bible. Again, Father Anthony is a professor at École biblique in Jerusalem. And so if you want to follow his work there, you definitely can. He's got some great books coming out, has written some good books as well, including, I think, a short translation of a biography of Saint Dominic. Is that right, Father Anthony?
That's right. George Bernanos. Yeah, it's a classic.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to checking that out. I saw that listed on your works, and it looks like a pretty short read, about 70 pages or so. But I love Saint Dominic, and I love his order especially. You guys do great work. So thank you for your work for the church, Father, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you.